It's the early hours of the morning, and an eerie voice wakes up the main protagonist of this story. A strange beginning to a strange day. Later on, he finds himself involuntarily grabbing his longtime friend's hand, and even going as far as to grab her left chest area. Needless to say, this leads to an awkward encounter that will have you cringing in sympathy. But what is causing this bizarre behavior, you might ask? Well, it all began the previous night when a strange organism attempted to enter Shinichi's brain through his nose while he was sleeping, but was ultimately repelled by a powerful sneeze. This organism then burrowed into his right hand and was on a mission to make its way to his brain. Luckily, Shinichi manages to thwart its advance by tying an earphone cable around his arm, but the consequences of his encounter with the strange creature will continue to be felt throughout the school day. At school it seemed he was dozing off, but his right hand was scrolling rapidly on his phone. He even gets in trouble with his teacher because of it. Needless to say, it was a rough day at school for our boy, and he decides to check out of school. Fate, however, has plans for him. As he walks home, he witnesses a young girl about to be sent on a journey to another world. Karkan must want to become a truck really badly. Without hesitation, he shields her with his body, and to his surprise, his right hand suddenly becomes an unstoppable force, demolishing the car's bumper in the process. And that's not all. He notices an eye pop up in his right hand, which only adds to his growing anxiety. Desperate to rid himself of this bizarre affliction, he rushes home and tries to stab his right hand with a knife, but the organism within stops him and reveals its form. Shinichi turns to the internet for answers, but even that proves to be fruitless. The next day, he wakes up to find his right hand reading about fishes, and engages in a conversation with the organism. It explains that it's not mentioned in any biology books, but also assures Shinichi that it can no longer take over his brain, now that it has matured in his right arm. It suggests they cooperate, and after a tense exchange, the parasite falls asleep, leaving our MC to contemplate the strange new reality that he finds himself in. The next day, Shinichi decides to go to the police for help. Not sure what he thought they could do, but okay. However, the organism in his arm lets him know it can sense one of its kind nearby. They soon find themselves face to face with a dog whose brain has been taken over by a similar organism. The organism seeks to kill Shinichi because he still has his brain intact. They run away, but the chase is on as the dog sprouts wings and goes after them. But our main characters quickly figure out the only way to stop the dog is to destroy his heart. On his way, he and the organism decide to call it Migi since it grew by eating his right hand. During gym, Shinichi manages to make a few good shots during basketball practice, and this impresses his crush, Satomi. This eventually gives him the opportunity to apologize to her for the earlier encounter, and the two make plans for a pancake date. Teen romance. It must be nice. However, a jealous admirer of Satomi called Nagai confronts Shinichi on the roof, challenges him to a fight, and begins to beat him up. Though he could easily use Migi to demolish his attacker, Shinichi chooses to hold back. Migi, on the other hand, isn't having any of it, and lands a heavy blow on his attacker, causing him to run away. In class, Shinichi learns about grotesque mincemeat murders happening all around the world from a classmate. He discusses this at home with his right hand, but Migi is hesitant to get involved, more so for his own safety. However, Shinichi's sense of justice won't allow him to stand by and do nothing, because these creatures are eating his fellow humans. Migi, once again, isn't having it and threatens to rob Shinichi of his senses if he opposes him. Later that day, they soon meet a parasite human, Mr. B, who tries to recruit Migi to be his right hand. He's so determined, in fact, that he cuts off his own arm to make space for Migi. When Mr. B loses too much blood, he tries to kill Shinichi, so Migi would be compelled to join him. However, Migi finishes him off very easily. The next day, Shinichi and Satomi finally have their pancake date, but it's clear that Shinichi's mind is preoccupied, and his appetite and manners have changed. He still tries to act normal though. That evening, they run into a group of kids throwing stones at a cat in the sand. Shinichi saves the cat and scares the bullies off. This act touches Satomi, and as they walk home she grabs his hand. She feels uneasy though and goes to grab his left hand. As cute as this is, hand holding in public is extremely indecent, and should be done in the privacy of one's own home. A few days, tension rises as Migi senses the presence of another parasite within the school building. During an assembly, the school introduces a new math teacher named Ryoko, who Migi immediately recognizes as the parasite he sensed earlier. It quickly becomes clear that Ryoko is just as aware of Migi's presence within Shinichi. It turns out she's his teacher, and when she finds out he hasn't written anything on his notebook, she calls him to meet her in the counselor's office. Ryoko reassures Shinichi that there is no need to be so tense, and even suggests meeting at a cafe after school to talk things out. She gets to the cafe with a man, Mr. A, who happens to be a parasite too, and it's there that she drops a bombshell: she's pregnant with a normal human baby, despite the fact that both parents are parasites. Ryoko warns Shinichi her only concern is protecting her human identity, and that if he poses a threat to her, she's capable of wiping out an entire classroom of students in just 3 seconds. The next day, while Shinichi tries to focus on Ryoko's math class, both he and Ryoko sense the presence of another parasite entering the building. The stakes have never been higher for Shinichi and Migi as they prepare for what is to come. Chaos ensues, and Mr. A goes on a rampage and begins massacring students and teachers alike. It's a bloodbath, and the atmosphere is thick with fear and panic. Shinichi is desperate to stop Mr. A, but Migi's plan to stop him involves sacrificing other students as a distraction. This is not an option for Shinichi, the Minister of Justice, so he comes up with a plan of his own. He sets up a barricade of tables at an empty hallway. Mr. A soon finds himself face to face with Shinichi and Migi, ready to fight. It's clear that their opponent is no joke, but the MC has a plan. While Migi counters Mr. A's attacks, Shinichi gradually gets closer and uses the sharp end of a chair leg to stab him in the heart. The battle is intense, but Shinichi's determination and Migi's strength ultimately prevail as they defeat Mr. A and save the school from certain destruction. Shinichi's victory over Mr. A left its mark on him. Mr. A stumbles to Ryoko's office to convince his baby mama to share her body, but is met with a deadly trap instead. Ryoko has set up an explosion that killed Mr. A, effectively covering her tracks and avoiding suspicion. With the school reopening after the incident, Ryoko quit her job because the school board were concerned that she was pregnant and wouldn't reveal the father's identity. She decides to have one final conversation with Shinichi behind the building. He asks her why they need to devour humans when it's not necessary for their survival, to which Ryoko replies that it's their primal nature to do so. She wanted to kill him, but decides against it because Shinichi's body is gradually changing. Meanwhile, Shinichi's parents plan a trip to the countryside. He initially disagrees, but later that evening agrees to let them go after Migi proposes that the probability of encountering parasites there should be lower. A few days later, Shinichi soon finds himself in trouble when he comes across Naiga, the bully from before, getting beaten up by a gang. He tries to intervene, but Shinichi is no match for the gang without Migi's help. Things take an unexpected turn when the supposed leader's girlfriend, Kana, intervenes and tells the gang to leave them alone. She tries to question him but gets scared after she looks into his eyes. The next day, Kana pursues him and becomes jealous when she sees him with another girl. This leads to Mitsuo, Kana's boyfriend, abducting Satomi and beating up Shinichi. However, Naiga comes to his rescue with an army of students from their school, and they engage in a full-scale brawl with the gang. Luckily, Shinichi and Satomi are able to get away. After Satomi patches him up at home, Kana the stalker pulls up at his door to apologize for what happened. When he gets inside his house, Migi warns him to avoid her because it seems she can detect parasites too. Meanwhile, Shinichi's parents are enjoying a peaceful sunset in the countryside when they're attacked by a parasite. His mother is beheaded and taken over by the parasite in front of his father, who manages to call Shinichi that night before losing consciousness. Shinichi is anxious as he waits for another call from his parents when a parasite shows up at his doorstep. His mother has been taken over, but Shinichi is unable to accept the reality of the situation. The parasite decides to go back and confirm his father is dead. Our MC is overwhelmed as he begins to recall memories of his loving mother. Since he was caught lacking, the parasite takes the opportunity to stab his heart, leaving him to die on the floor. If you're still watching, take a moment to type an F in the comments for Shinichi and his mother. Anyway, Shinichi's life was hanging by a thread, but luckily, Migi stepped in to save the day. Migi became merged with Shinichi's heart and patched him up, but this came with its own can of worms. He got the Peter Parker treatment. His vision improved and he didn't need his glasses, and his personality and body underwent a dramatic transformation. Shinichi's father was still in danger, and he was determined to take down the parasite that had taken over his mother once and for all. When he gets to the hospital, he meets his father who is distraught and in denial about what had happened. The tragedy of his father's situation was almost too much to bear, but Shinichi held his composure and stayed at a local inn, ready to act at a moment's notice. But the worst was yet to come. That night, Migi reveals a weakness he developed due to the operation on Shinichi. Migi will need to sleep for 4 hours a day, at random times, and will be unable to sense the presence of other parasites. This left Shinichi vulnerable, and the fear of the unknown weighed heavily on his mind. The next day, while keeping watch outside the hospital, Migi senses the presence of a parasite and our MC, burning with rage, rushes to the scene. Shinichi encountered Mamoru Yuta, whose jaw had been taken over by a parasite. I'm not going to lie, but that seems very inconvenient. I'd rather have a parasite take over another part of my body. If you're still here, comment a part of your body where you'd prefer a parasite takeover, and I'll be sure to reply. Anyway, it was a meeting of two kindred spirits, both struggling with the same affliction. Shinichi and Yuta decide to become friends and work together, promising to have each other's backs. That night, while Shinichi is trying to sleep, Migi reveals that 30% of his body mass is now circulating through Shinichi's veins, enhancing his physical abilities in the process. This explains why he's now the Japanese Peter Parker. Migi also reveals he can split into smaller fragments. The next day, Yuta calls Shinichi, revealing that the parasite they've been hunting is in his sights. Shinichi urges Yuta to make an escape, and gives him time to reach his location. However, fate has its own twisted plans. Right before the showdown, Migi decides it's the right time to take a nap, but not before transforming into a blade, so he can give Shinichi an edge in the battle. Meanwhile, Yuta is getting his ass beat by the enemy parasite, and he even takes damage to his heart, causing him to fall off the edge of a cliff and onto a ledge. Just then, Shinichi arrives at the scene and steels himself for the battle ahead. He overpowers the parasite, but doesn't land the finishing blow when he sees the burn mark on his mother's hand. A few days later, Mitsuo's boyfriend sees Kana looking at Shinichi's picture on her phone. Fueled by jealousy and a bruised ego, he tries to pick a fight with Shinichi once again. This time, however, Shinichi uses his spider senses to dodge all his attacks, and puts him on the ground without breaking a sweat. That night, as he lay in bed, he wonders whether something is wrong with his heart. He fears he isn't human anymore. The next day, while walking with Satomi, Shinichi stumbles upon an almost lifeless dog lying on the road. Filled with compassion, he takes the poor creature to the park, providing it with a peaceful place to draw its last breath. Satomi is relieved to see him care for the dying dog, and is grateful that deep down, he hasn't changed. Literally 5 seconds later, when the dog finally passes away, Shinichi gets up and tosses the puppy into a trash bin. Satomi is incredibly shocked by this display, and rightly so. After she runs away, Shinichi has a change of heart and properly buries the dog. Later that day at school, Migi senses a parasite nearby. The parasite took the identity of a transfer student named Shimada Idio, and joins Murano's class. Little does Shinichi know that Ryoko has sent him to keep an eye on our protagonist. After gym class, Shimada confronts Shinichi and Migi, and tries to offer them reassurance. He says that he and Ryoko are desperately searching for ways to survive without resorting to cannibalizing humans. Migi then cuts the conversation short, and then they leave. After class, Kana ran into Shimada, but she mistook him for Shinichi. For some reason, she can sense parasites. This triggers some warnings in Shimada's head, and he tries to drag her off. However, Shinichi stops him and threatens to kill him if he does anything to people he knows. As he walks her to the train station, she tells him about her ability to sense his presence, and he warns her to run away if she ever gets that feeling. Spoiler alert, she won't. A while later, Kana's boyfriend spots Shimada staring at her, gets angry, and challenges him to a fight. Unfortunately for him, he ends up in a brutal beatdown in the bathroom. Talk about a harsh reality check. It seems the beating wasn't harsh enough because Mitsuo rallies his gang to seek revenge against Shimada. Migi senses the hostility, and Shinichi arrives at the scene just in time to prevent a bloodbath. He then intimidates their leader and the bullies run away. Satomi approaches Shinichi, but she is worried about him, and tells him he has changed. This makes him get angry and he yells at her, causing Satomi to leave him alone. Meanwhile, Yuko becomes suspicious of Shimada's true nature when she notices him heal after a baseball leaves a dent in his head. She follows him around and to her shock, witnesses Shimada change his face, revealing his true identity. However, she thinks she's seeing things, mostly because she has a crush on him. Determined to confront him, Yuko musters up the courage to face Shimada alone. I don't know why she thought that was a good idea, but okay. The next day at class, she prepares herself and calls him to an empty class for a one-on-one conversation.
Meanwhile, Yuko narrowly dodges one of Shimada's lethal strikes, barely escaping certain death. In a daring move, she retaliates by hurling a toxic chemical at Shimada, inflicting significant damage. Seizing the opportunity, she leaps out of the window and luckily for her, a tree breaks some of her fall. Shimada, however, took significant damage because of the chemical and this sends him into a frenzied rampage. He unleashes a wave of violence, claiming the lives of unsuspecting students. Shinichi's class evacuates along with the others, but he soon realizes something odd. Satomi's class is still unaccounted for. Shinichi wastes no time, racing back into the building to search for Satomi. However, he soon found a bunch of mangled corpses scattered across the floor. He begins to have a panic attack but luckily, Migi manages to calm him down. Nothing will stop him from finding Satomi. Amidst the chaos, Shinichi discovers Satomi and two other students cowering in a corner. Satomi is so shaken she can't even stand, and honestly, I don't blame her. Unfortunately, the other two students, gripped by fear, ran away and the monster ate them. With Satomi's safety as his priority, Shinichi carries her and jumps out of the window, not caring if his extraordinary abilities are exposed. He just wants to protect Satomi at any cost. Meanwhile, Shimada is demolishing all the cops that are attacking him. It's all up to Shinichi now. Determined to outsmart Shimada, Shinichi decides to make his move from the roof of a nearby building. He has to be more than 300 meters away so he can't be sensed hidden from Shimada's sight. He awaits the perfect moment to strike. And then it happens. Shimada unknowingly steps onto the roof of the school building, unaware of our boy's cunning plan. With their combined strength, Shinichi hurls a rock at Shimada, one-shotting him. As for Shinichi, he and his crush made up and began to talk again. She was grateful to him for saving her life. Because of what happened, the government began to make plans on how to find and defeat the parasites. At a special meeting, a doctor explains that pulling out a strand of hair is enough to expose one's identity as a human or parasite. Meanwhile, Kana has been having weird dreams about Shinichi. She waits for him around his school, and when she spots him, they walk together for a while. He addresses what she told him before about being able to sense him and warns her not to approach him again. When it's clear she won't do that, he lashes out at her, more so for her safety. Meanwhile, a parasite goes into a mafia building and absolutely obliterates everyone there. The guy in the white vest becomes important later in this story. At that moment, Shinichi goes on a nice date with Satomi. They go to the cinema, have lunch, and even go to a park. It was a great day for our boy, and he and Satomi finally share a kiss. Kana, unfortunately, saw this and left completely heartbroken. The next day, Shinichi sees a group of politicians campaigning on the street, and Migi notices that some of them are parasites. One of them is the parasite from before that murdered all the mafia guys. Just as they make eye contact, Kana approaches Shinichi. This makes him worried. Shinichi goes home and discusses the appearance of the parasites trying to be politicians. He was a bit worried about Kana's safety though, because those parasites were in her area and she might approach them. However, later that night, Kana senses a presence nearby and approaches because she thought it was Shinichi, only to realize it's someone else entirely. She receives a text from Shinichi about meeting up the next day, and together they go to an abandoned building. Shinichi decides to reveal everything about himself and the parasites to Kana, despite Migi's advice against it. Migi was asleep at that time, so he couldn't show him to her. Kana doesn't believe him, and, before leaving, assures him that she can distinguish him from other parasites, which is why she'll only approach when she senses his presence. A while later, Migi reveals to Shinichi that Kana had begun to emit signals that could attract parasites, and this raises concerns that other parasites might sense her too. This causes Shinichi to panic, leading him to cancel his date with Satomi and instead meet up with Kana to demonstrate his powers and let her know he was saying the truth. He gives her detailed instructions on where to meet him, but because she wants to prove she can tell Shinichi apart from parasites, she ignores his instructions and even leaves her phone at home. Kana uses her Walmart spidey sense to find Shinichi's location. However, to nobody's surprise, her instincts betray her. She didn't find Shinichi, she stumbles upon a parasite eating a human. She tries to run away, believing that Shinichi will come to her rescue. Unfortunately, he arrives too late. Kana's heart is already pierced by the parasite. Filled with rage, he one-shots the parasite, removing its heart with his bare hand. Kana passes away a few moments later, with Shinichi cradling her in his hands. Her passing fills him with guilt, but even though he feels that way, he doesn't shed a tear at her funeral. He, however, begins to question his humanity after he and Mitsuha get in a fight after Kana's funeral. Confused and angry, he goes into a nearby forest and hits his head on a tree until he bleeds. However, the sight of his red blood brings him comfort. If you enjoyed this video, you'll enjoy other ones we have made. Click on any of the ones available on the screen. See you later.